my kitchen, everybody. I'm gonna go over how to do some water bath canning. I can tomatoes every year. I've done it this way for probably the past 5 or 6 years. I'm gonna show you my process. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do it, so if you've learned differently for somebody else or you found a different video that you like, go ahead, try different ways, but this is the way that I like to do it. I'm gonna start off with what you need to succeed. I'm following a recipe from the National Center for Home Food Preservation. I printed it out so I can make notes, make little reminders for myself. I'll include a link for this specific recipe. I'm following the recipe for whole or halved tomatoes packed raw without added liquid. And I'm gonna do the water bath process. They also have instructions for how to pressure can, which you can also do if you would like, but in general, pressure canning takes a little bit more time. For water bath canning, what you're gonna need is just one pot that is gonna fit your jars, whatever jar size you use. I prefer quarts. You can also do pints. I guess you could also do half pints if you just want little tiny baby tomatoes and cans in your pantry. I'm gonna do quarts, so I have this big pot that I'm actually processing tomatoes in right now. This is tall enough for my jar to fit in with about 1 inch of water over the top of it, and then room for it to boil. You're also gonna want I just use rims, jar lid rims, so that I can put my jars on top of them and they're not gonna be sitting on the very bottom of my pot right against that heat, which is gonna affect the glass and increase potential for cracking jars. So I have some just old, they're kind of rusty jar lid rims at the bottom of my pot, my jar on top, enough space for 1 inch of water, and then room to boil. That's the size of pot you use. This is just a big stock pot, maybe it's 3 gallons. You can also buy a pot specifically for canning, but you don't need to. And if you're doing pints, the pot doesn't need to be as tall. So we have our pot, our recipe, our jars, and then the one other really important thing that I think you're gonna want for canning, just makes it so much easier, that's not an ingredient, is gonna be this little jar grabber that makes it really easy to put your hot jars into boiling water and then pick them up out of your pot of boiling water. I didn't have one of these for the first 2 years that I canned. I just used tongs, and you gotta have a really tight, strong grip. It is possible, but this just makes it so much easier and less likely for you to drop your jars, both in the pot and while taking them out. So if you wanted to invest anything into canning, I would get one of these. This is another little nifty tool. You can buy canning supplies kits, and this just came in one. Otherwise, I wouldn't have never known what this was. It has a little magnet on the end, which makes it easy to fish out your lids, because you're gonna process your lids in your pot of boiling water. We'll get there soon. Little magnet, but then it also has this flat end, which you can use to get bubbles out of your jar after you pack it. Not necessary though. You could also use a spoon or a chopstick and then just use your tongs or a long fork to get your lids out of your pot. Ingredients. This recipe says that an average of 21 pounds is needed per canner load of 7 quarts. A standard canner is going to be able to process 7 quart jars at once. This pot only processes 5, so 20 pounds would be a little bit too much for me. We sell in boxes of 20 pounds of our red slicing tomatoes. So a 20-pound box is gonna be about 7 quarts, which would also be 14 pints, give or take. And then the second and only other ingredient you're gonna need is 5% acidity vinegar, and it is very important that it is 5%. The acidity in water bath canning is what is doing the preservation, not the canning itself. The canning itself is only creating a seal, while the acidity, which we're gonna use white vinegar, 5%, is preserving the product. All right, the first step is gonna be to wash your jars. I always just do a light wash, even if they're brand new jars, just to make sure everything's nice and clean. Then we're gonna stick them in our pot to get them boiling so we can sterilize. The next step is to get your jars in a pot of water, turn it on and get it boiling. It'll take about 30 minutes, so it's important that you do this right away. It might take even longer depending on the size of your pot. You want your jars to be submerged, full of water, they're not floating. And we're gonna let this get to boiling, and then we're gonna boil them for about 5 minutes so they can sterilize, and then we'll start working on our tomatoes. Don't forget the lids. The next step is gonna be to prepare your tomatoes. You don't need to scrub them very hard, just getting a good rinse. Once they are rinsed off, then you're gonna half them, core them, and I also trim off the little blossom end, just because that is a spot where the skin really sticks. Things like that that don't seem soft are fine. I just leave those on because we're gonna peel the skin off anyway. Something like this, it's a lot bigger, and when you press it, it's a little soft. I'd trim that away. I do not blanch my tomatoes to get the skin off. Just don't like blanching, I guess. So instead, I broil the tomatoes until the skin kind of starts to bubble, pull them out of the oven, let them cool, and then the skin peels right off. All right, these look ready. They're starting to crack, bubble a little bit. Some of these aren't quite cracking, but that's okay. They'll all be pretty good to go. All right, our tomatoes are out of the broiler. We're gonna peel the skin. I don't always aim for 100%, just what's easy to peel, and then some of it gets put in my jars, and that's okay. Skinning tomatoes is gonna be finicky no matter how you do it. You can choose to broil them. Sometimes if the tomatoes are super ripe, you can actually just peel them like with a paring knife. But I like to have them, broil them, and then let them cool before I peel the skin off. This is a great task for if you have multiple people who want to help you process tomatoes. Makes it go a little bit faster. All right, our jars have been boiling for about 5 minutes. I'm gonna pull them out. It's important to dump the water out of the jars into the sink and not into the pot, because we're gonna fill the jars with tomatoes, and if there's too much water in the pot, it's gonna overflow. All right, and then we're gonna try and keep our water boiling a little bit. Oh, and don't forget the lids. All right, then you're gonna do 2 tablespoons of vinegar in each jar. If you're doing pints, you'll just need 1 tablespoon. I like to do this first, and then I'll know where to fill my tomatoes up instead of having to add vinegar on top of the tomatoes and kind of guessing. All right, and then we're gonna pack our jars. I just use my hands. My tomatoes are pretty cool, but my jars are hot, so you'll want to be careful of hot jars. All right, once I get it pretty full, I'm gonna start pressing, which is gonna get the juice out. We're not packing these in liquid, we're just packing them in the tomato juice. So we pretty much want to pack the jar as full as possible until the liquid is at the same level as the tomatoes. We do want to leave some headspace, so I like to pack my jars until right when, on these jars, there's an 800 milliliter mark, somewhere just between that mark and this lower ridge on the rim of the jar. All right, that's looking pretty much full to me. And I like to start with bigger pieces at the bottom and then have those smaller pieces for that fine-tuned level at the top. And they do kind of fall apart, and that's okay. All right, we're going to use our debubbler. You could also use a fork or a knife. On the edge, try and get any bubbles out. You can kind of see them along the sides, especially when I get the ones at the bottom. This is just going to help you make sure that you have the right height of liquid in there. Okay, now this next step is really important. We need to take a clean rag and wipe the rim of the jar. The rim of the jar is what is making contact with the lid to create a seal, so you really want to make sure it's nice and clean. If there's any gunk around there, and since these jars were hot, it can kind of get stuck on there, then you won't get a good seal. All right, then we're going to put our lids on. Just make sure, do a little double check that these are nice and clean. They should have been processed with your jars to be sterilized in boiling water for about 5 minutes. All right, now this next part is also fairly important, but I also don't know if doing it wrong is going to ruin all of your jars. You want to get your rim of your lid on not too tight, but not too loose. I like to tighten it until just where I can barely wiggle it loose. I'm going until you just start to feel a little bit of resistance, and then I'm stopping. So it's pretty easy to take off. I'm not putting a lot of pressure on it. There's just barely starts to be resistance. It's not that big of a deal, I don't think, as long as it's not cranked down all the way, because we want pressure to be able to get out. But if it's too loose, it might also fall off in the boiling water. So that's all. It feels difficult to explain, but I also think that if you don't do it the exact same way that I'm going to do it, it doesn't mean that all of your jars aren't going to seal. All right, my jars are packed with tomatoes until just between this 800 milliliter mark and the bottom lip of the neck. The rim is on loosely, and they're ready to go back in my boiling water. All right, let's go for it. Let's do it. I like to go really slowly because this is glass and boiling water, and if you go too fast, sometimes they'll crack, which is fun. I usually have about 1 jar crack per year, but I'm also canning a lot, so that's maybe 1 out of 40 jars. And that's probably mostly due to me reusing jars maybe a little bit too many times. If you start with new jars, you hopefully won't have any cracking. All right, my jars are submerged. There's about 1 inch of water, maybe a little bit less, above them. I'm gonna turn my heat up to get them boiling and set my timer based on what my recipe says, based on my elevation. We're in Minnesota. This is my first time canning in Minnesota. So we're gonna go for 85 minutes, and I just start that right when I put the jars in the water. I don't wait for it to start boiling. If you're gonna do a second batch, that 85 minutes is a great time for you to start processing your next 2 trays of tomatoes, washing your jars. Obviously you'll have to wait to pull these out to get those jars sterilized in the water bath. I boil it with a lid on, just because it makes it go a little bit faster. Setting a timer for 85 minutes. And you'll just want to adjust the heat if you hear it boiling over a little bit. These have been processing for about 85 minutes. I'm going to pull them. All right, and this is what a can is going to look like when you pull it out. The liquid really separates from the solids. This is totally normal. Once you hear that the jar has sealed, which happens after you pull it out of the pot, they usually takes about 2 to 15 minutes, sometimes a little bit longer, for the jars to seal. You'll hear a little, let them cool down, and then I like to flip them over just to kind of incorporate the solids back into the liquid so they don't stay super separated like this. But sometimes jars don't seal. I'm not actually sure why this happens. I processed these jars for the same amount of time. I wiped the lids. They're the same tomatoes. One of them is sealed and one of them is not. This is the sealed one. This is the unsealed one. If your jar doesn't seal, there's a couple of options. You could just throw this right in the fridge, use it in the next week or 2. You have a can of tomatoes still, but it's not going to be shelf stable. You're going to have to use it up kind of quickly. If you're like, oh gosh, not many of them sealed for whatever reason, you could also pour off some of the liquid and then throw it in the freezer. You're going to want a little bit more headspace for freezer just because freezing expands and you don't want your jar to crack. So just pour off some of the liquid, screw the lid on really tight, throw it in your freezer, maybe write the date on it, and it's still a preserved tomato. If you really wanted to, you could also reprocess the jar. I've done this before. I would recommend pulling off the lid. I'm not going to touch it because it still might seal. Who knows? I would recommend pulling off the lid, giving the rim a really good wipe down, and then putting a different lid on it and processing it again for the same amount of time. This whole process takes about 1 hour to do all of the prep, which is waiting for your water to boil, washing and preparing the tomatoes, broiling, removing the skin, and packing your jars, plus that 85 minutes of processing time in our pot with full jars, which is about 2.5 hours total for 1 batch. If you're doing multiple batches, you can work on that prep work while you're processing your second batch, so it actually is a bit beneficial to do multiple batches in one day just because you can kind of condense all of that. So this isn't a small project, but to me it's really worth it. I've been doing this again for about 5 years. I love having tomatoes ready to go, easy to use all through the winter. I like just canning them halved and not making a sauce or anything because then they're super versatile. I can make sauce in the winter, I can add them to chili, I can throw them in pasta, and I can just use them in a lot of different ways. There's also recipes and instructions for canning tomato sauce as well as tomato salsa on the website for the National Center for Home Food Preservation. I've used a lot of their recipes and they always have great instructions. If you have any questions for me, please let me know. I'd be happy to answer, and happy canning!